Hi everyone, my name is Ike and this is Eddie Helps. Today what we're going to be talking about is your sump pump. Now, the first thing we're going to start with is if you need a sump pump or not. So first, let's talk about whether or not you actually do have a sump pump. Some of you will have a sump pump in your home and some of you won't. If you don't have a sump pump, you more than likely have a lower water table than other people. If you have a sump pump, you more than likely have a higher water table. This is all going to be designed by the builder. If you have one, it's usually in the basement in some sort of closet, kind of like where I am now. It's usually going to be in the ground, just like here. This sump in particular is just in his closet. It has a metal lid over it. This is pretty standard for what we're looking for. Now, what does a sump pump do exactly? A sump pump just removes the storm water or water in the ground, water that accumulates under the foundation, from under the foundation. It takes it and pumps it outside somewhere so that it doesn't accumulate under the foundation. It's designed to keep your basement dry. The sump pump, if you do have water issues in the basement, is going to be the first line of defense of keeping all of that water outside of your house. So if you have an issue with a heavy downpour and you're having water come up through the foundation, a lot of times it's usually because the sump pump isn't working or because you simply don't have one. A lot of older homes don't have sump pumps and they actually need them. So that'll usually be one of the reasons why you need to have one installed. All it does is remove the water accumulated in the foundation and disperse it somewhere else away from the foundation. So in general, when it is raining outside, you will hear the pump running. It's going to be periodic, so it's going to turn off and on. A lot of times we hear kind of what we hear here. I don't know if you can catch this on camera, but there is a small drip in there. It's not raining right now, but sometimes you'll actually hear water entering into the pit. You'll also know that rainwater's getting in there. A good audible way to know if your pump is working is to just stick around the area for a little bit and wait until the water level rises enough in the pump pit and listen for the pump to turn on. That's a very easy way to do it. It takes a little bit of time, but it makes it so that you don't have to manually manipulate the sump pump down there to make it turn on. So if you do have a heavy rain, expect to hear the pump go off. That is a good thing. There's a misconception out there that if your sump pump is running frequently, that means there's an issue with the pump. That's not true. If the pump is running frequently, that just means it's doing its job. If you have other issues where the pump is running inconsistently, that might be something else. But you want your pump to be running when it's raining outside. That's a good thing. So we've talked about when and why your sump pump should run. Now let's talk about if your sump pump continuously runs, or maybe periods of time where it's just running for a prolonged amount of time. So really, the sump pump should not be running just by itself with no water going in there. Now, like I said before, an easy way to check for this is just to listen to see if water's going in there. But if for whatever reason you can't hear water entering the pit and the pump is just continuously running, that usually is a sign that the sump pump, one of those components on the sump pump, like the float or maybe the switch, has gone bad and it's keeping the pump from turning off. Another thing that might have the sump pump continuously running, or something that you might want to be mindful of, is if there's no rain outside and the pump is turned on, that's usually a sign that the pump has some issue with it. If there's no moisture and it's very dry and you wouldn't expect to hear it, usually you want to take a peek at the sump pump. You want to make sure that it's not just running continuously. If it is, the way that you just simply address it to keep the pump from burning up is just unplug it. Now, before unplugging it, you do want to look in there and make sure that the pump water level is not too high, because if the water level is at the brim of the pit and the pump is running, that essentially means the pump is not working. The pump motor is running, but it's not pushing anything out. At that point, you want to start looking at something else. But these are just things to look for if the pump is continuously running. Now, a lot of times when I'm looking at troubleshooting a pump, when I come onto a job, I want to look at two things if a pump is continuously running. I want to look and see if the float is stuck. The float, which I'll explain, is a little device. It's on every sump pump. It looks very different. It's pretty much a relay to the pump to tell it to turn on and off. If that little switch goes bad, the pump doesn't actually know when to turn off, so it will continuously run. So if I show up on the job and there's a continuously running sump pump, that's the first thing that I check. I check it just by sticking my hand in the pit, and you kind of see here, there's actually an access hole back here. Not everybody's house is going to look like this, but I stick my hand in the pit and I'll just manually flip this the float switch up and down. And that will give me a good indicator as to what's going on with the this sump pump float. Another thing that I will check is I'll check the power supply coming from the pump. So another issue that you might come across is a pump that's simply not working at all. Now that could have two issues. One being the pump float is not working. It's much like if it is continuously running, or it could be a power issue. Now a lot of times the power issue is closely related to the sump pump actually going bad. So in some cases you might experience an issue where if the sump pump turns on, it trips the breaker. A lot of times that's because the motor windings are starting to go bad and is drawing too much power, so it actually trips the breaker. That is directly related to the sump pump. So if I show up on a job and somebody explains to me that the sump pump is tripping the breaker, it's usually because the sump pump is bad. Another thing is if the sump pump isn't working at all, what I'll do is unplug the sump pump and I'll test the receptacle, whatever it's plugged into. And I'll just do that with an electrical tester. It can be a voltage tester or a meter of some sort, just to make sure that there's power at that switch. Sometimes there's no power at the switch and there's some issue with the breaker, in which case you need to hire an electrician and have them fix that before replacing the sump pump. The way to pretty much diagnose what's going on there is unplug the sump pump, test it. If you got no power, check your breaker. If the breaker doesn't work, there you go, call an electrician. Now, another issue that you might come across with the sump pump not working at all is simply from, like I said before, the float being stuck. Now, this can be fixed by just sticking your arm into the pit and adjusting the float where it needs to be. But you want to be careful because it's not a matter of just fixing the float and being done with it altogether. If the float got stuck against the wall of the pit, more than likely the pump is not positioned where it needs to be. At that point, you probably need to reposition the pump to get the float away from the wall so that it doesn't get stuck again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to test the functionality of the pump in here. Now, some of you, like I said, every scenario is going to be different. I'm in a small closet here. This is a metal lid on this sump pit. This lid is bolted down. Some of you actually have what are called radon sealed pits, and that's pretty much a gas that accumulates in the ground, and it's a toxic gas. You can't really breathe it in. It's not good for you to breathe in anyhow. And the lid for the sump pump will be sealed to keep that gas trapped, and there'll usually be like a bigger pipe coming out of it going somewhere to exhaust it into the atmosphere. In those scenarios, you can't really test the sump pit or put any water in there because the lid is completely sealed. Sometimes if you have a little clean out or access cap, maybe you can do it, but I find that most times you can't without breaking that seal, removing the lid and all of that kind of stuff. In this scenario, that's not the case. If you do have a scenario like that, unfortunately what you'll have to do is you'll probably have to call a plumber to test it, or you'll have to break that seal and do it yourself. Now in this case, the lid is open, there's no issue with radon. There's actually just a grommet back here that doesn't do anything. It just goes to an open hole in the pit. So what I can do to test this pump without sticking my arm in there is that I can actually take a 5-gallon bucket of water and just pour water down that hole there. Now what that's going to do is that's going to raise the water level in the pit, and once it raises the water level, the float will engage, which is just the switch to turn the pump on and off, and it should start pumping the water out if it works properly. If it doesn't, then it won't. Another thing I can do, which I'll show you, is I'll just stick my arm in there, grab the float, and pull it up. Now, from your point of view, what you're going to hear, or what you should hear at least, is you should hear water surge through this pipe here. You'll hear a jolt and water will go out. And for you as the audience, that's how you know that water is escaping the pit. So as you just saw, we tested the sump pump using the two different methods that I usually use when I test sump pumps, which is pouring water down there and actually sticking my arm in and testing the float manually. Now, to show you a visual of kind of what I did, because it was kind of hard to see, is let's just say This is not the sump pump that was in there, by the way, but most sump pumps are going to look somewhat like this and operate similar to this. This is a Zoller M53 sump pump, and it's got a bunch of other things hooked up to it. We're going to ignore that for now. Let's just focus on the sump pump function as itself. So what you can see here is you have the pump and you have the float here. Now, when the water level rises, what happens, just like a toilet, is it pulls this float up, and at some point, a switch turns the pump on. Now, when the water level drops, as the pump is removing the water, it'll drop slowly and eventually turn the water off. That's how the float actuates. It actually goes up and down just like that. Now, most pumps work like this. This one in particular has a guide rail on it. Some other pumps have cords, so they kind of hang off and they go up and stuff like that. Every sump pump is going to operate the same way. There's just a couple minute differences in the actual float itself. So that's essentially what I did when I manually turned it on. I stuck my arm into that pit and I just grabbed the float and pulled up on it, and I forced it to turn on. You can do that if you want to test your sump pump, or you can simply pour water in there. You'll need enough to bring that float all the way up and it'll turn on. That's another way to test it. Sump pumps vary in all shapes and sizes. They have different horsepowers. This one here is a 3rd horsepower. Most sump pumps will go 3rd horsepower, half horsepower, 1 horsepower. The bigger the pump, the more horsepower it has usually. For this application, this pump will be plenty good enough. Now, there's 2 sump pumps that are out there on the market that you're usually going to be trying to decide between. It's going to be a regular sump pump or a battery backup sump pump. Now, what is a battery backup sump pump? A battery backup sump pump is essentially a sump pump that has a battery hooked up to it in the event that power goes out at your house. The way a normal sump pump works is if you lose power, if there's some sort of storm, your sump pump is kaput. It's not working anymore because there's no power. So if you want, if you want like the safety of mind, you want to just not ever have to worry about it, a battery backup sump pump is usually the way to go, because if the power goes out, the battery will keep the pump running until the power is turned back on. That's really where the battery backup system shines. A standard pump will do the job, but if you lose power, you're kind of out of luck. So what I have in front of me, what I was explaining before anyways, is a standard sump pump, but it has this kind of rig on it. This rig is Zoller's battery backup system. Now, every manufacturer has their own system. As a plumber, I like Zoller system because it comes out of the box like this. It's all assembled. You can't get any easier than this. I've put together other types of battery systems, battery backup systems, and they're kind of a nuisance. You kind of have to kind of get in there and move things around and try to make sure everything fits right. It's just a mess. This has way less wires. Everything comes in one piece. You have to hook up a couple fittings, and that's about it. It's literally plug and play. So with the battery backup system, other than the rig that you have here with all the adapters, what you're going to see is you're going to see a secondary float. The secondary float is going to be here. So this is going to be for your secondary pump. You have your primary float, which I showed you before, and then you have your secondary. Now, talking about secondary pumps here. So now, this is Zoller's secondary pump. As you can see, it's much smaller than the primary. Now, the way this thing works, once we get the wires and everything hooked up, is once this float is actuated, once it's pulled up, it will actually turn this pump on. Okay, so in the event that you have, and here's where the secondary pump kind of comes into play. So the battery backup system keeps the power, or it allows for there to be power for the primary pump. But let's say the primary pump dies. Let's say there's just too much water, can't handle it, or let's say it's just an old primary. Whatever happens to the primary, you still have the secondary pump. The secondary pump will take on whatever water is coming into the pit until you have time to replace the primary. So most times, to be honest, in my experience, the secondary doesn't see too much action. Most of the action is going to be on the primary pump, and that's just because the power goes out. The primary pump is usually plenty good enough to keep the water flowing. But in the event that the primary pump goes out, you at least have a secondary. Most battery backup systems come with a secondary pump. So if the water level gets up to that point where the secondary has to turn on, you are really in a little bit of a pinch. You definitely need to take action. You definitely need to start looking to replace the sump pump, because once the secondary goes out, and as you can see, this is much smaller than this one. Once this guy goes out at that point, that water level is going to rise and you can't control it. But that's what this thing's supposed to do. It's supposed to buy you time. That's what that does. Most battery backup systems come with a controller. So this is Zolar's control box. This thing is nice because, as you can see, the plugs are all integrated. You don't have to do any wiring. Some of the control boxes you have to wire up. You can literally hook this up to the battery, which I'll show you the deep cycle battery that we use. It's a marine battery. And then you plug this end into it. So I love these in particular because it has the 2 holes there, and you literally mount this thing to the wall and it lives there. It lives there. It has little light indicators on there to tell you what's going on with the system. If the system goes into alarm, it screams so you can't miss it. That's always nice. And then it'll tell you when the battery's dead. So most of them come with controllers, but I like this controller, the one that Zolar has. That pretty much covers the battery backup sump pump and all of the stuff that's hooked up to it, except for your choice of battery. So let's talk about the type of battery that we use for this system. This here is just a deep cycle battery. There are marine batteries which you can use, or you could use just a regular car battery. These things are pretty expensive. One thing I would suggest is don't cheap out on the battery. You want the battery to last as long as possible. If you get a cheaper battery, you have less reliability and higher risk of flood. The whole point of having a battery backup system is to have the most quality components to protect your basement and keep it dry. If you're already thinking about or concerned with the possibility of flooding in your basement and power going out, you definitely want the most quality parts to keep the basement dry and the most quality backup system. So spend a little bit of extra bucks on a nice battery that will last a while. When it comes to replacing these batteries, it's super simple. I'm not going to really explain to you how to do it, but I will tell you this much. It's a matter of putting leads, so you have your positive and negative leads. It's a matter of putting 2 leads together and taking them off. So most homeowners can do it. I've seen old ladies do it. Okay, so I certainly believe you guys could do it too. You just take this one out and you put the new one in. Like I said before, most pumps will have a controller. It will tell you when the battery is dead. So it kind of makes it easy for you so that you don't have to keep looking at it. So that's pretty much wraps up the battery backup system. Like I said, it's going to vary. There's a lot of systems out there. This is just my favorite, and this is also the easiest to work with. Okay, so let's talk about the cost that we're looking at here. Now, if we're looking at bigger picture, whenever it comes to protecting your basement, I would suggest you don't cheap out. So even if you do stick with a single pump, get a nice quality single pump. Not every situation needs a battery backup system. The first questions that I'll usually ask my customers is if they have issues with power outages. Some people don't experience those types of issues. So if you don't have an issue with power outages, I'd probably say you don't need something as expensive as this system here. But if you do, it's definitely worth the investment. Now, let's talk about what this looks like in cost. The battery itself is like $200, and these things just get expensive. The sump pump and system itself, the rest of it, the whole rig, is like $1,000. And then you have the cost of installation by a technician. And if you choose to do this yourself, you'll be saving some money, but ultimately you're looking at least $1,200 for a battery backup system, a quality one. You can get one for like $400. I do not suggest it. A couple of reasons why I wouldn't suggest it. You won't have optimal protection for your basement. There's a chance that something's going to go wrong and something's going to fail, and that protection you thought you had is not going to be there. And of course, it always goes when you're not at home. So you don't want to be worrying about that type of stuff. Another thing is, most plumbers, technicians, whoever you have work on it, they don't want to work on those types of things. So when they show up at your house and they see a cheap backup system in there, they're not going to want to work on it. They're going to want to replace the system with something that's better quality. And this is like a question that I get a lot of times is, will you work on my backup system? I go look at it. If it looks like a piece of junk, I'm going to say it looks like a piece of junk, and then you're going to kind of move on. So that's usually what it looks like if you don't invest in a quality system. Now, investing in a system like this, if you do go with the battery backup system, you want to think bigger picture. The bigger picture here is the investment you make here is going to save you a lot of money in damages. Okay, when a basement floods as a result of a sump pump overflow, we'll just say like whatever flooding from stormwater or groundwater, When a basement floods, it's never on a small scale. It's always on large scale. So it's like you have several inches of water in the basement, and it's very expensive. It comes down to, like, you call a plumber, they come out, replace the pump, it starts pumping out. It takes a couple hours to pump it out, and then you need to call a restoration team. They come out and start cutting drywall, removing flooring, all of that type of stuff. It gets really expensive really fast if you have a flood scenario in your basement. So if you want to avoid the possibility of having that type of scenario, invest in a good sump pump system. Just don't cheap out. Remember, get yourself a good sump pump, invest in quality equipment. If you have any other questions, leave a comment and check out our other videos. Thanks for watching.